Sometimes, it takes almost nothing. One email, one comment in a meeting, one sentence from someone who somehow knows exactly where to press. You read it once. Then again. Maybe you start typing a reply. You delete it. Try another version. Delete that too. And 20 minutes later, you're still sitting there, having an argument with someone who isn't even in the room. That's the strange thing about difficult people. They don't always take much of our time, but they can take an enormous amount of our attention. Long after the conversation ends, we're still explaining ourselves to them in our heads, still proving our point, still imagining what we should have said. Taoism has an interesting way of looking at this. It doesn't begin with, "How do I win against this person?" It begins somewhere else. Why am I letting this person decide what happens inside me? That's a harder question. Because sometimes the other person really is rude. Sometimes they're unfair. Sometimes they're manipulative, arrogant, exhausting, or impossible to reason with. Taoism doesn't ask us to pretend otherwise, but it does ask whether fighting them in the way they want to be fought is actually helping. Very often, it isn't. Most of us have learned some version of the same strategy. If someone misunderstands us, explain more. If they accuse us unfairly, defend ourselves. If they challenge us, prove them wrong. If they push harder, push back harder. It sounds reasonable, and sometimes it is. But anyone who has spent enough time around difficult people eventually notices something. Some people are perfectly happy to argue much longer than you are. They can turn a small disagreement into an afternoon, a minor comment into a personal trial, a simple misunderstanding into a debate about everything you've ever done. And the moment you accept that kind of conversation, you're no longer deciding where your attention goes. They are. This is where Taoist thinking becomes useful, not because it teaches us how to defeat people, but because it gives us permission not to participate in every struggle offered to us. The Tao Te Ching, traditionally associated with Lao Tzu, grew out of ancient China during a period of instability, warfare, political rivalry, and competing ideas about how people should live. The Zhuangzi, another foundational Taoist text, came from a similarly unsettled world. These were not books written by people living in perfect peace, surrounded by reasonable neighbors. They came from a culture that knew conflict very well. And yet, again and again, Taoist texts return to strange ideas. Softness, yielding, non-contention, water, emptiness, doing less. Not because the world is gentle, but because meeting force with more force is not always the wisest move. One of the most famous Taoist ideas is Wu Wei. It's often translated as non-action, and that can make it sound like Taoism is telling us to sit back, do nothing, and let life happen. But that's not really the point. Wu Wei is closer to acting without unnecessary force, doing what the moment actually requires. Instead of adding 10 extra layers of resistance, ego, and tension, you can see how useful that becomes around difficult people. Suppose a coworker says, "You always make everything more complicated than it needs to be." There's a good chance your mind immediately starts building a case. Always. What about last week? What about the project you fixed? What about all the times they made things harder? Before you know it, you're no longer discussing the actual problem. You're defending your entire character. So what would a less forceful response sound like? Maybe simply, "Okay, which part do you think we can simplify?" That's it. You haven't admitted they're right. You haven't surrendered. But you also haven't followed them into the argument they were trying to start. You've moved the conversation back to something concrete. That's what Wu Wei can look like in ordinary life. Not mystical. Not passive. Just refusing to waste force where force isn't needed. The Tao Te Ching compares the highest kind of goodness to water. It's probably one of the most repeated images in Taoism. But there's a reason it has survived. Water doesn't look powerful. You can put your hand through it. You can disturb it with a stone. You can block part of a stream with your foot. And yet water has one enormous advantage. It doesn't insist on holding one shape. If the land changes, it changes. If something blocks its path, it moves around it. Water doesn't stand in front of a rock demanding that the rock become more reasonable. And a lot of our suffering around difficult people comes from doing exactly that. We keep thinking, they shouldn't speak like this. They should understand. They should apologize. They should realize what they're doing. They should finally change. Maybe they should. But what happens if they don't? That's where flexibility becomes more than a nice philosophical idea. It becomes practical. Instead of asking, how do I make this person behave the way I want? You start asking, given the person standing in front of me, what's the best way to deal with reality as it is? That's a very different question. And unlike the first one, you can actually answer it. There's an old story in the Zhuangzi that captures this beautifully. Imagine you're sitting in a small boat. Another boat drifts across the water and bumps into yours. If you look up and see that the other boat is empty, you might be annoyed. Maybe you mutter something. Then you move on. But imagine the same boat hits you. And this time, there's a person inside. Everything changes. Now you're angry. What are they doing? Why didn't they move? Were they not paying attention? Do they think the river belongs to them? The collision itself hasn't changed much. What changed is the story around it. Now there's someone to blame. Someone who should have known better. Someone who has done something to you. That's what makes the empty boat such a useful image. It doesn't mean people are never responsible for what they do. Of course they are. And it doesn't mean every insult or act of disrespect is imaginary. The point is simpler. We often add intention before we really know what happened. Someone doesn't reply to your message. You think they're ignoring you. Someone is short with you. You think they're disrespecting you. A driver cuts across your lane. You decide they're an idiot. Maybe you're right. But maybe the person didn't see you. Maybe they had a terrible morning. Maybe they're distracted. Maybe they're awkward. Maybe their behavior has absolutely nothing to do with you. Sometimes there's a person in the other boat. Sometimes there really isn't. Either way, it helps to check before you spend the rest of the day fighting them in your mind. There's another lesson here that's harder, especially if you care a lot about being fair. Most of us don't only want to do the right thing. We also want people to understand that we did the right thing. We want them to know what we meant, why we said it, what really happened, why their interpretation isn't fair. So we explain, then explain again. And sometimes that works. But sometimes you're explaining yourself to someone who isn't interested in understanding you. They've already decided what happened. You send a paragraph. They pull one sentence out of it. You explain that sentence. Now there's another problem. Soon, you're writing an essay to defend yourself against someone who was never reading with an open mind in the first place. There comes a point where explanation stops being communication. It becomes begging for permission to be understood. Taoist texts often warn against excessive self-display and self-assertion. Not because you should never speak for yourself. You should. But because there's freedom in realizing that not every wrong opinion about you needs correction. Sometimes you say what needs to be said. Once. Clearly. Then you stop. If they choose to misunderstand you after that, perhaps the misunderstanding belongs to them. Your life does not have to become a permanent appeal hearing. And sometimes, 6 months of consistent behavior will say more about you than 6 pages of explanation ever could. But this part matters, because advice about Taoism can easily become bad advice. Be like water. Don't resist. Don't argue. Fine. But what if you're dealing with someone who repeatedly crosses the line? Someone who insults you, manipulates you, takes advantage of your patience, ignores your boundaries, then silence isn't always wisdom. Sometimes silence just teaches them that nothing happens when they treat you badly. Taoist softness should not be confused with having no backbone. The Tao Te Ching talks about how living things are soft and flexible, while dead things become hard and rigid. It's not praising helplessness. It's pointing toward adaptability. A branch that can bend survives winds that break something rigid. And being flexible means having more than one response available. Sometimes you let something go. Sometimes you say, "Don't speak to me like that." Sometimes you leave the room. Sometimes you stop replying. Sometimes you put something in writing. Sometimes you take the problem to a manager. Sometimes you stop seeing the person altogether. That's still flexibility. You're not reacting automatically. You're choosing the response that fits the situation. The Taoist question isn't, how much bad behavior can I quietly tolerate? It's closer to, what needs to be done here, without creating more conflict than necessary? Those are not the same thing. Imagine there's someone on your team named Daniel. Daniel likes to interrupt. Not occasionally. Almost every meeting. You start explaining an idea, and halfway through, he's already talking over you. Sometimes he'll even repeat something you said 10 minutes earlier, as though it's a new suggestion. If you challenge him directly, he gets defensive. If you bring it up privately, he tells you you're taking things too personally. At first, you may want to beat him at his own game. Interrupt faster. Speak louder. Call him out in front of everyone. Maybe even embarrass him a little. It would probably feel good. For about 30 seconds. But now you've built the meeting around a fight between you and Daniel. There's another way. The next time he interrupts, you say, "Give me 30 seconds to finish this point, Daniel. Then I'll come to you." And then you keep talking. No apology. No anger. No 5-minute speech about how he always interrupts. Just the boundary. If he later repeats your idea, you might say, "Yes, that's the direction I was suggesting earlier." The next step I'd add is, again, no drama. You're simply putting the conversation back where it belongs. You also start sending your main proposals in writing before important meetings. Now there's a record. If the pattern continues and it starts affecting your work, you speak to your manager. But instead of saying, "Daniel is impossible," you say, "On these 3 projects, I was interrupted while presenting work I owned, and some of the ideas were later attributed elsewhere. I'd like clearer ownership during future meetings." That's harder to dismiss. More importantly, you haven't made your mission change Daniel. You're changing the conditions around Daniel. That's often far more effective. You don't have to move the rock. You can change the route of the river. There's another danger with difficult people that doesn't get talked about enough. Over time, they can train you. A sarcastic person makes you more sarcastic. A suspicious person makes you suspicious. Someone plays little political games, so you start playing them too. Someone talks behind your back, so you begin building your own little group. Someone is cold to you, so you decide you'll be colder. Eventually, you might win. But you've also spent months becoming more like the person you couldn't stand. That's a bad trait. If someone can make you cruel just by being cruel first, they're still controlling the situation. They've simply moved the control somewhere deeper. One of the quieter lessons in Taoism is to stay close to your own nature. Not to become numb. Not to allow everything. But to stop letting every outside pressure reshape you. You can recognize manipulation without becoming manipulative. You can deal with an aggressive person without making aggression your personality. You can protect yourself without enjoying revenge. Sometimes the cleanest form of victory is being able to look at someone's behavior and think, "I see what you're doing. I'm still not going to become you." And this brings us to our own perspective. We think there's a slightly unrealistic version of inner peace that's become popular online. The idea that if you're wise enough, calm enough, or spiritually developed enough, Difficult people will simply stop bothering you. We don't believe that. Some people are annoying. Some people will hurt you. Some will disappoint you badly. Some will say things you'll replay on the drive home, even when you know you shouldn't. You don't need to pretend none of that affects you. The more useful question is, how long do they get to stay in your head? Maybe years ago, one rude comment could ruin your whole weekend. Later, it ruins an evening. Then maybe an hour. Eventually, you notice yourself getting angry, and you can almost watch it happening. You feel it. You don't deny it. But you also don't build a house for it. You come back. To your work. To dinner. To the people you actually love. To whatever you were doing before that person stepped into your mind. For us, that's a much more believable kind of peace. Not becoming impossible to disturb. Becoming better at returning to yourself. There may be someone in your life right now who you've spent years hoping will become a different person. A parent who is less critical. A partner who finally listens. A coworker who becomes self-aware. A friend who stops making everything about themselves. You keep thinking, if I explain it the right way, if I'm patient enough, if they finally understand how much this affects me, maybe then things will change. Maybe they will. People do change, but some don't. Or they change much more slowly than we'd like. And there's a difficult kind of freedom in asking, what if my peace can't wait for them? That doesn't mean you stop caring. It doesn't mean you stop communicating. It means their transformation is no longer the price of admission. For your own stability, you can love someone and stop joining every argument they start. You can forgive someone and still keep your distance. You can understand why a person behaves the way they do and still decide that you don't want that behavior in your life. You can let someone have the last word without giving them the last word inside your own head. That's an important distinction, because difficult people don't necessarily become less difficult when you study Taoism. Your relationship to them changes. You stop treating every provocation as a summons, every criticism as a trial, every misunderstanding as an emergency. Sometimes you answer. Sometimes you draw a line. Sometimes you walk away. And sometimes you simply recognize, this does not require me. So the next time someone pulls you into that familiar feeling, the tight chest, the imaginary argument, the need to reply immediately, wait for a moment. Before asking what you're going to say, ask something else. Does this really need my resistance? Sometimes the answer will be yes, but not nearly as often as we think. A short answer may be enough. A clear boundary may be enough. Distance may be enough. Silence may be enough. Because not every difficult person is a puzzle you're responsible for solving. Sometimes they're simply part of the landscape, like a rock in a river. The water doesn't need the rock to disappear. It keeps going. And here's a simple question for the next video. Which is harder for you? Letting go of an argument, or letting go of the need to be understood?